Hi, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you're all well and enjoying the podcast. As always, I welcome any thoughts, suggestions, and feedback you have to make the podcast better, and, of course, any suggestions you have for guests you'd like to see. I wanted to share with you a new way to participate in the Whiskey Ring Podcast Bottle Share Club. There are several people who have reached out to me about being put on a waiting list for the top tier. After much thought, I've decided to open that tier up to more people. If you have been hesitating, or if you are a current supporter wanting to level up, reach out to me at david@whiskyinmyweddingring.com or through social media or Patreon, and I'll be happy to help you move up. I also wanted to send a special thanks to my current $25 a month patrons, who have agreed not only to this change, but who have been truly irreplaceable supporters of this and who make this podcast happen. Thank you to all of you in no particular order. I'm talking to you, Ken, Jesse, Jim, Bill, Don, and John, Yana, Connor, Zach, Scott, Ollie, Steve, and Jake. Without your support, this podcast wouldn't be happening anymore. And thank you for helping me to keep the lights on and keep guests coming to you every week. As always, you could support the podcast for as little as $1 a month, with ad-free episodes starting at $5 a month. This support is the reason the lights stay on, and to make sure the podcast and website are the best they can be. Thank you to all who are already patrons, and I hope to have more listeners join soon. Visit patreon.com/whiskyinmyweddingring to join today. Without further ado, here's a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we are talking to someone who represents not one but two independent bottlers and also distillery owners. And he's someone who I've gotten to meet several times now through the New York City kind of spirits. What would you call it, Gary? Like friendship groups and such, the circles we run. Yeah, the underground.
The seedy underground of New York whiskey.
Exactly. So I'm thrilled to welcome on Gary Pickard. He's with Pacific Edge Wine and Spirits. He's the Northeast Regional Manager. And today we're specifically talking about two of my favorite independent bottling brands, William Cadenheads and AD Rattray. Now, there are, just as a teaser, there are other brands, companies, and areas that Gary may be returning to the podcast for the future. But for today, we're focusing on these two quite historic and really boundary setting brands. So, Gary, welcome on.
Thanks for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So, with that, I just wanted to start. Why don't we start with Cadenheads? So, we'll do a little on Cadenheads, a little on AD Rattray, and then we'll bring them both together at the end for how we're moving forward. So, starting with William Cadenheads. This is, by most accounts, the oldest Scottish independent bottler.
That is absolutely correct.
1846. So, throw us a little history of 1842. I'm sorry. I should know that because it's the anagram of 1824 when most of these distilleries became legal. So, or at least went legit. So, throw us a little history of how did, what is William Cadenheads? How did it start?
Sure. I mean, and of course, there's a lot of twists and turns to any of these entities that are still producing today, especially ones going back as far as William Cadenhead and AD Rattray. So, if you're out there and I'm getting something wrong, please let us know. But I'm going to do my best to wind us through the serpentine history of these brands. So, like I said, 1842, the beginning of William Cadenheads, but William Cadenhead actually did not start the brand. The brand was started by a man named George Duncan, and it was started in Aberdeen. He set up there as a vintner, and it was actually, I can recall the address. At 47 Netherkirkgate was the old address. If you go there to Aberdeen now, you wouldn't be able to find it on the street. I think they've changed the layout of the city, but this man George Duncan set up there as a vintner. And around 1858, a young Mr. William Cadenhead came into town and started working for Mr. Duncan. He inherited the company from Mr. Duncan and renamed the company as William Cadenhead. William previously worked in the textile industry. He worked for I believe it was yarn. He was like a yarn salesman, textiles, things like that on the road. I believe he did that with his brother. And William Cadenhead led that business up until the turn of the century, up until I believe 1903 when he passed away, or in 1904, I believe he passed away. Um, when he passed away, the company went into the company was went over to Robert W. Duthie. And it's there where we kind of see where Cadenhead starts to take shape as what we know it today. Um, Duthie actually focused more on Scotch whiskey, blends. He started focusing on Demerara rums, things like that. He put a lot more into advertising than William Cadenhead did. There was an old slogan called "By Test the Best," and if you find old advertisements of Cadenhead, you'll see that there. Blends start coming out of the Cadenhead facility. Hielanman was a popular one. The Pataki side was another popular one. And then in the 30s, tragedy strikes, and Robert Duthie is struck by a train while going across the street and killed. Um, he didn't have any heirs, so the company went to his sisters. His two sisters were his survivors, and they didn't know anything about the Scotch business or the beverage business or anything like that. So they put a long-time employee named Miss Oliver in charge of everything. And Miss Oliver, by most accounts, was kind of stuck in her ways, and she didn't like a lot of change. The problem was, if you know your whiskey history from the 30s up until about the 60s, when the trust board told Miss Oliver, we think it's time for you to possibly retire. Things could probably be better. There was just a massive surplus of whiskey. They didn't really know what to do with a lot of it. And that led to, in 1972, the largest sale by that time in the UK of spirits. It was held by Christie's, and Cadenheads was sold off. All the assets were sold off, the rights were sold off, and a lot of those barrels just went in various directions. But it's there where we see the modern founding of Cadenheads and Mr. Headley Wright, who everyone might know as the head of Springbank Distillery, who recently passed away. But for 60 years, he was the head of Springbank Distillery. He bought the rights and assets to William Cadenheads. He bought it because there was a glass shortage that was going on in the early 70s. And he's like, we need some bottles to bottle some Springbank and some things like that. So let's go ahead and do that. And the story goes that the glass never arrived. He got everything else from Cadenheads, but he never got the bottles. So no one knows what happened to the bottles. And again, whether that's a romantic story or just a funny anecdote or something that actually happened, who knows? But it's there that we have the modern founding of Cadenheads, owned by Jane A. Mitchell Company, the Mitchell family, whom Headley Wright was the last heir of that. And everyone knows with Headley's passing, all these assets, Springbank Distillery, all the Springbank properties, Campbeltown properties, including William Cadenheads, is now part of a trust for the town of Campbeltown. And that's where it remains today.
So, like you said, has a fascinating history that goes pretty far beyond the just this idea that they're an independent bottler. That's in some ways that's kind of one of the modern identities,
Yeah,
for sure. But it does skip over some significant points in history. And one of the ones that I wanted to pick out, well, the first one I want to pick out, let's say, is at when in the 30s, when Miss Oliver she didn't really take over, she was kind of given charge, I guess, because she knew what was going on there. As you said, she was there for several decades, and was known for being stuck in her ways. What piqued my interest, though, was that around that time, early to mid 20th century, is when we happen to see some women either controlling or running or owning distilleries, particularly in Scotland. And these are things that were kind of common knowledge, but not really given attention until, let's say, the last decade or so.
sure.
And I'm curious if within Cadenheads or just generally, there's any more information about not just her style, but what was the reception of her leadership by peers at her time? Was it seen to be weird that a woman was running this kind of business, or did she care if that was the case?
I and I mean, it's a very good question. I think to really get the answer to that, you'd have to, really get a time machine and go back and kind of ask the people that were in the Scotch industry at the time, because it was such a different landscape. Single malt was unheard of back then, and yet alone you did have Cadenheads doing certain things with that, but blends were really the name of the game. And so with any kind of changes that were happening come like the late 50s, early 60s, and you're starting to see more single malts, possibly some single casks that are going to special organizations and or purposes or things like that, you have a woman by most accounts that's kind of stuck in the ways of like, we're going to do this business the way that Mr. Duthie wanted to do this business, and establish it as, marketing blended goods. And that's what's going to keep the lights on. And that's how we're going to keep going. They kept acquiring barrels and filling the warehouses, but I guess the demand wasn't really there, or they just weren't innovating at that time. I mean, we hear so much about innovation and new marks coming out constantly in the modern landscape, but I think it was important back then as well. People were, probably more stuck in their ways, but you still needed some new products out there to kind of push your bottom line and get your name out there.
Especially like you're saying, you have such a glut of whiskey around the world at that point when you get to the late 40s and 50s that something you have to have something to cut through all the noise.
Yeah,
and even
exactly.
and frankly, even if you did, you might still have trouble. You might have the best thing on the market, but you may still have trouble selling it because there's just so much stuff out there.
Yeah, and you definitely need a mind for that, I think, back then. And again, I'm speaking for people that I'm not, but just kind of as an outsider's look, and as a history in 2020 hindsight, to Cadenheads never owned a distillery. They were brokers, and they were blenders and bottlers. And so, they worked with the stocks that they had. And if you didn't have somebody who had a vision to be able to do different things, I could see, being stuck within those ways of the normal business and doing business like that for 30 plus years. So it's not, I don't think we should fault her by any means, but I think she was just trying to, navigate a very difficult landscape back then.
And she'd also have, in deference to her as well, she'd have a couple of runways to build up. We're talking the 30s, so post-prohibition, rolling up after that, going into Great Depression, so financial challenges, economic challenges. Then World War II, another, shift from ethanol to fuel as opposed to beverage alcohol. Then the glut. Like, it would have been a lot of things coming her way that, for whatever her style was and whatever the reception was, the company survived through all of that. So she must have been doing something right in some ways.
It's an interesting kind of coincidence, I think, that the same year that the auction happened, the Christie's auction, where they sold off a lot of the barrels and all the assets, it was the same year that Old Raj Gin launched. So that's a Cadenhead property, and that's a very new innovation for them. So I think, with the new leadership, they're like, all right, we need to take this in another direction, because martinis are king right now in the early 70s. And so it was a pretty smart move, I think.
Yeah, the Bond effect in full splendor.
Exactly.
Martinis and clear spirits taken over in the 60s and 70s. God help us all.
I don't mind if they're made, but give me a neat whiskey any day.
No, I'm kind of the same. I do enjoy gin quite a bit. Vodka, I don't really have a place for on my shelves. A good gin sometimes is refreshing. It's nice. So we get to the early 70s when, Miss Oliver has now been retired, forcibly. It's in a way.
Kindly.
Kindly.
I mean, her out. Yeah.
Right. I mean, she would have also been elderly at that point. I mean, it wasn't like you're telling a 40-year-old to retire kind of thing. So, and I hope that doesn't come off ageist. That's not how I'm saying it. It's just,
it's a matter of facts.
It's a matter of facts. I mean, not sometimes you have a Jimmy Russell who's 94 or 95 and still kicking, still going through the rickhouses, but
Very true. Yeah.
he's the exception we think of for a reason.
Mhm.
So anyway, we get to the 70s when you were talking about this at the time, the largest sale of spirits. It's handled by Christie's, and you from the sound of it and the descriptions of it I could find online, it sounded like just everything must go. And like we're gonna salvage every penny we can from all these casks that are lying around, from
Yep.
the bottles, as you were saying, that never showed up but still were on the block. And I guess my one of my first thoughts was there a point where the company, the board of directors or overseers thought, basically we've had a good run, like we're gonna not just liquidate the assets to pay off debts and all of that, but maybe whiskey's in a big downturn, rum, brown spirits are in a big downturn, let's just call it a day on that? Or was it even during that nadir, the thought was that Cadenheads would continue in some way?
I think that the board of trustees that were there through the 50s and 60s, just they kind of saw the writing on the wall, and they knew that the change was going to come, and again, it was liquidation. Everything must go, and I think they wanted to see, and again, I'm speaking for people who I am not, but the fact that a maverick such as Headley Wright kind of picked this up, and he was just known for constantly making moves and going against the grain and taking risks and taking chances. I think that's the energy that a brand like this really needed to succeed. And with that, launching Cadenheads into, again, the modern era and how we kind of know it, known for its single cast selections, known for Old Raj, known for the boutique outlets within different cities, and kind of stretch its footprint throughout Europe, and who knows, maybe America. I mean, it'd be great to have an outpost over here, but we'll
I
see.
wish it would. I got to visit the one in London, and it was just a lot of fun to visit. I will admit I didn't buy anything. I had already blown my whiskey budget up for that trip on a bottle of Imperial. So
Well, that's okay.
that's
That's
but
respectful.
yeah, but it was still a fun browse to walk in, and you get a sense of it's like you said, it's boutique. It doesn't feel like your typical liquor store. It feels like kind of mom and popish, if you will, or old
Very much so.
countryside.
I haven't been to the London one. I've been to the one in Edinburgh, and it was such a great experience because you go in, and you're kind of on, like, you're right outside Royal Mile, and you have really wonderful stores there, but a lot of them are a little bit touristy, very competitive because everyone's trying to sell scotch, because even your basic newbies who just want to bring home a bottle of single malt scotch from Scotland, and then you have, like, your sharks like us who are kind of going in and trying to find the rarest and coolest stuff. You get to Cadenheads, and I remember walking in. I'm not sure if this is the same thing for the London store, but there was a blackboard with all the distilleries of Scotland on it, and broken down alphabetically and then by region in different colors. But it looked like it had just been, like, drawn that morning, and what they had available and what the prices were. And there were some phenomenal offerings. I walked away with it was a younger Glen Grant, but I bought it because I think it was like 68 or 69% or something like that. It was extremely. I've never seen a Glen Grant that high, and I said I have to try this, and it was phenomenal.
Yeah, the learner, it was similar like that. Kind of the shelves were one, maybe two bottles deep, so it wasn't like anything was hidden. Everything was very in view.
Mhm.
And I again, I think it's just fun. Like when I think about I guess a couple of months ago now, I would have had Lost Lantern on the podcast. So independent
Love it.
spirits, independent
Yeah.
bottler of American spirits, and I've known them for a while now, but I also got to visit their physical location in Vermont, and so you see the tasting room with the bottles around, and the back end with the operations and all the barrels that are laying around, and it's fun. It's different than going to a distillery and seeing that, because when you're at a distillery, you're talking about that distillery, you're talking about those products, that line, that that are all coming in some way from the same source, the same
Machinery. Yeah.
yeah, the same machinery, the same ethos
Yeah.
of production. But when you're at an independent bottler like a Cadenheads, you can find a Glen Grant next to a well, I was gonna say Highland Park, but you probably can't use the name Highland Park. It's one of those distilleries you just can't use the name on
You
most
mean
of the time.
The Orkney Distillery?
The Orkney Distillery, exactly. Even though there's 3 or 4 of them now, but if it's over a certain age, it's Highland Park. So a better example, I guess. So you can find the Glen Grants, you can find maybe you can find a couple of Imperials, I don't know. But some just distilleries that you wouldn't necessarily see, and you can have people behind the counter and walking around who actually know what these various distilleries are. They can talk about that distillery's stills. Like there were a bunch that I talked about in the store that I had never heard of. I think it was the first time I heard of Tobermory.
Okay.
And then a month later, I happened to not Tobermory. That's one. No, maybe it was Tobermory. It's definitely one with a T, and it wasn't Tomentuel. But one that I just Tormore. That's what it was.
Okay. Yeah.
And funny enough, like a month later, the Scotch and Whiskey Society had a Tormore bottle. I was like, oh damn, that's really good
And
stuff.
now you're in the know, exactly.
Now they're in the know. But these are distilleries where, as an independent bottling shop, you've got to know the specs on all these distilleries. You have to know, for the whiskey nerds like us who walk in and we're like, we want somewhere that's probably going to have a shorter still versus a higher still. We want the stronger flavor, the 2.81 of a Mortlock or
Right.
kind of thing.
And also
you have to have people
when,
who know the language.
yeah, and then knowing when the barrels were filled, who was owning the companies at that time, what their production methodology was. I mean, a lot of this stuff it matters. Like it's very, very different. Things change from time to time, and so newer make won't taste like older make, no matter how much it aged. Yeah, it's like people describe going into rick houses and cask warehouses as being a kid in a candy store, but like going into an independent bottling warehouse is like going to like a candy store expo, because you have everything from everywhere, and there. People ask me usually like, why are distilleries? I don't know if this is one of your questions, but why are distilleries giving not giving, but what's the decision process in giving certain barrels to independent bottlers as opposed to keeping them in house and using them for with the Scotch being short with a lot of things. We're seeing the reduction of age statement whiskey. We're seeing all these kinds of things going on in the market. Why won't they hold on to casks? And the answer that I normally get on this is that these are barrels that they're not bad barrels. Everyone thinks, oh, they're not good enough for the brand, so let's just give them to an independent bottler. They just might not fit within the protocol and the fingerprint of what they want expression wise within their core range or what they're looking to make. So if a barrel is exhibiting certain characteristics, it might be better off as a single cask, and if they don't have any way to be able to do that, they'll maybe put that up on the block for an IB to pick up.
And I think of independent, both sides of that. The independent bottler who's choosing that cask or casks to buy, but also the distillery putting out those casks. When you have single barrels or these 1 to 2, maybe 3 barrel batches that, as you said, they're from the distillery, but they don't match the profile or what they're looking for, and they're not objectively bad either, because sometimes you just get bad whiskey and you can't do much with that. No amount of port's going to cover that. So I guess what I look for, if I'm getting a single barrel, what I look for is something that's either hyper representative of the brand or of the distillery, or something that is completely off profile. Because anything in the middle, you have to go for the extremes. Anything in the middle is going to fall probably within something that distillery would put out.
Yeah.
On its own.
I could absolutely see that. And you have certain distilleries that won't put out over a certain ABV, so you might find something at a different alcohol percentage or certain casks that might be experimental. Like I definitely like searching for the weirder, more eclectic kind of stuff. A case in point, we have this new Cadenheads collection that's just landed, maybe the last like year or two, called the Original Collection. Smaller batches, everything's at 46% ABV to kind of stretch the length at which we can reach the different markets that we can reach for Cadenheads. And there's a 6-year quote unquote an Orkney bottling. And as we just said, we know exactly where that's coming from, but it's 100% ex-bourbon cask. And so, knowing that particular Orkney distillery knows that, that sherry kind of touches most everything that comes out of there. So to
Sure.
find something that's, there are exceptions to that, but predominantly, this is a really good
Yeah,
example of a younger, only ex-bourbon Orkney, and it's kind of cool, and I kind of gravitated towards that. Even though it's a younger age statement, I think that that belays the quality of and again, it doesn't have to be older to be better, but everyone's looking for 14 to 17, that sweet spot. But I think there's good whiskey being made at all age statements.
agreed. And there's one other thing. We're recording on a Friday, and my brain is just shot from the week. I'm trying to keep track of my questions. With I guess the other part with the independent bottling too is, you know what, I just can't remember that question, so I'm just gonna
If it comes back, it comes back.
come back. So
Yeah, if I'm jumping
with
around too much, let me know too. I mean, I know
no no you're
I tend to be tangential sometimes.
no no you're fine. Um, so I'm jumping to the current state of Cadenheads in particular.
Hmm.
With the passing last year of Headley Wright, as you said, the firm's ownership went into trusts, and I'm I guess I'm not sure that I've seen that kind of ownership transfer happen in the whiskey industry. So I'm curious what that means for the brand, and then if there are plans to. Yeah, I guess let's just start. What does that mean for the brand on a day-to-day basis?
And I don't want to talk out of turn here either, because we hear a lot about the Campbeltown Trust when it comes to some of the other assets that I represent, Springbank and Glengarry and things like that. Cadenheads, there are still members of the Mitchell family that play very important roles within the role of William Cadenheads. The trust, I'm not quite sure how that would influence a lot of that. I know for a fact that for the two distilleries that was set up just to protect those properties. But in terms of with Cadenheads, I do believe that there are some kind of heads that are still kind of calling the shots that are involved within the Mitchell family.
Gotcha,
But
gotcha.
but to answer the second part of your question, I think that the goal now for them has been to increase the reach of the brand. For a wide swath there was not a big presence of Cadenheads in especially in North America. They were keeping everything within their shops. They were keeping everything within the UK and the EU markets. Um, we're starting to see a change of that. This launch of the Original Collection line is their attempt to be able to kind of stretch, their fingerprint a little bit further. Um, uh, so we're getting allocations of Cadenheads. There's that A word that everyone loves, the allocations of Cadenheads for the North American market. But they're shared by the UK and the EU market and the global market as well. So these are not exclusives that we're getting. It's just they're able to, since these are all small batches of anywhere from 2 to probably 4 to 5 barrels, that just stretches a little bit further. So, but what we're getting is not, it's not a lot. We're getting anywhere from, I'd say, 20 to 60 cases per um, per SKU, per expression that want to come out, and we're probably getting them maybe 4 to 6 at a time, maybe 4 times a year, which is still pretty good. There's a lot of variety happening there. Um, our job at Pacific Edge is to try to make sure that we're balancing those allocations countrywide, and to try to get these bottles to all the markets where they need to go. Of course, there are going to be focus markets where people are drinking more Scotch, where Cadenheads has a little bit more gravitas. But we also want to try to build new markets as well. So it's that balancing act. And I think Cadenheads is feeling that as well. I don't want to speak for all independent bottlers, but I think that, with the demand for whiskey being what it is, unprecedented, there's, the cask management and making sure that, you're not just, pushing out all these barrels. You have to maintain a certain amount of inventory to be able to maintain a brand. And so I think they're being very careful about how they're doing that, because they don't want to close any of their retail locations. They also want to be able to feed a global market. So there's again this trapeze walk that we have going on there. And we have to see where it goes, and hopefully, as probably every guest that you have on here says, hopefully there's more coming in the future.
It occurs to me that with the tie-in with Springbank in particular, that there is a parallel there. I mean, Springbank is not the largest distillery in Scotland by any means. It's on the smaller half of the spectrum.
That is an understatement. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a big distillery, and it's not pumping out tons and tons of LPAs every year of spirit. But at the same time, it has a almost cult-like following, I would say. And I don't think that's overstating it. Like, there are people who are Springbank or bust for whiskeys. And you and I had a conversation, and tell me if I'm speaking out of turn now, that those allocations for Springbank, as an example, may only come in twice a year.
We're seeing them more regularly, and again, not to get off the beaten path here, but just to touch on that, and we could probably fill like 3 or 4 episodes full of Springbank talk,
Sure.
especially if we feel the angry phone calls. But we're probably getting the American allocation for Springbank is happening regularly, which is a really nice thing to report. And we're seeing quarterly allocations. So, every 3 to 4 months, I'd say we get a rather healthy chunk. And again, it's our job to kind of spread that out throughout this massive country of ours, and try to make everybody a little less unhappy. Let's put it that way.
Sure. And you're right. And hopefully we'll do an episode on Springbank in the future. And I think the way that I was thinking about it in that ethos is that Cadenheads is also not positioning itself as this huge behemoth of independent bottling. You're still choosing cask. You have a lot on the website about the ethos and how you choose barrels and how that has developed over time.
Yeah.
And the other question did come back to me. It was specifically to independent bottling. It was that I think people sometimes either they forget or they don't know that in Scotland I think we're close to 200 distilleries at this point.
I think it might be over actually now, especially with the planning ones that are being planned.
Yeah. So we have a lot of distilleries there, but as opposed to in the US, where pretty much every one of them has at least like a tasting room, maybe a visitor center, but you can go and get stuff. There are plenty of distilleries in Scotland that are not like that. They're built or were built to make for blends and to be components of blends. And even some of the most massive ones. I mean, Kalila is at least a top 10, if not a top 5 producer by LPAs.
Yeah, by volume. Yeah, exactly.
By volume. And that's mostly going into Johnny Walker.
Yeah.
And so there's a role that IBs play where there are distilleries that don't put out their own product, that like I don't know if there's a more regular expression. Even Kalila itself only does like a 12-year-old.
Yeah, a lot of anybody who is an independent bottling or bottler fan definitely sees your regular suspects, your Linkwoods, your Inchgowers, your Manickmores, and if you can find actual original bottlings of these, they're wonderful malts. But we know them just because they're a lot of them are made for blends, or they're just made, we see them more, we associate them more with independent bottlers. Yeah, and I think it's also a difference of the UK and the EU market versus the American market, what actually makes it over here, because things are much easier to find over there than they are over here if they're gonna be anywhere, or the production is low, or they're gonna service locally before they go overseas.
Sure, which makes sense. They're just look at. I mean, the answer is always follow the money, and
Yeah.
if you have a market that's going to eat it up or drink it up in this case in Europe, it's a lot less shipping cost to move it around the UK and Europe as opposed to bringing it over to the US or
And let's be
Japan,
honest,
Australia.
North America, with our antiquated, to be generous, liquor law here, and then by state and then by county, it might be more hassle than is worth for some of these smaller producers, or some of these producers that don't have the name recognition, that are just going to blow out cases.
Absolutely. The just to kind of wrap up for the moment on Cadenheads,
Mhm.
I wanted to dive a little bit more into Campbeltown. So, as we're recording, next week is going to be the Campbeltown Malts Festival,
Correct.
and it's one of those festivals like the equally famous Fagile on Isla that just celebrates as many distilleries as possible in that area. And I haven't been to one yet. I would love to go to both Campbeltown and to Fagile and to Speyside, but Campbeltown in particular has a special importance to the Scotch whiskey industry, and it's something that Cadenheads, again, as in part of the marketing, is very proud of their role in being in Campbeltown, having a strong presence there, for sure.
Yeah.
And I'd just love to go a little bit deeper into why Campbeltown is so important.
Sure, sure. I mean, people call Campbelltown the spiritual home of Scotch whiskey, and per capita, um, you know, uh, historically, it was. I mean, we know right now that the largest density of distilleries is it within the Speyside region.
Mm.
Everything along the River Spey. That's where you throw a rock and you hit a distillery window. But
Mhm.
back in probably kind of like the 19th century, into the 20th century, and when you start, the Patterson crash really changed a lot of it, and there were a lot of just things happening within that change, from century to century. But before these changes started to happen, Campbelltown was the home of Scotch whiskey. You had numerous distilleries. I don't have a count off the top of my head, but it's not a large region either. Kintyre Peninsula, and then you just keep driving down, and then you're kind of there. But the only ones to kind of survive were Springbank and Glen Scotia on the other end of the peninsula. And
Mm.
it was so bad that for a minute there, the Scotch Whisky Association was going to declassify Campbelltown as a whiskey making region. And the story that I heard, it was actually Headley Wright, who said, well, and this was back, classic Malts Diageo era, um,
Mm.
and the different I mean, like within the regions, they're I'm going on a tangent again, but within every
Yeah.
region, like not every single distillery is producing in a Speyside style in Speyside. Not everyone's producing in a Highland style in the Highlands. There's massive differences in production and geography and history and everything like that. But anyway, um, Heather Wright said, well, we have two distilleries. What's the problem? He said, well, I guess you need three, because the Lowlands have had three distilleries at that time, that were operational. And so Headley actually said, well, so if I came up with another distillery, we'd be able to keep our classification. And they said, sure. He's not crazy enough to build another distillery. And that's when he built Glengyle. So that's the story of how Glengyle came up. And if you go visit Springbank, Glengyle is, literally is a stone's throw away from there.
And so this episode will come out obviously after the festival, but I of course wish Cadenheads, wish the entire area of Campbeltown a fantastic festival. And I'm sure I'll be seeing pictures from mutual friends like Charlie. I'm sure will be there, and who
Yes,
runs the
yes. I,
Drammers.
I have FOMO already. And
Yeah,
I'm not going. I won't be at Face Shield this year either. But we can't be everywhere all at once. But
yeah,
that seems like those are the places to be in the upcoming months.
absolutely. So with that, we're gonna turn the page a bit. So after talking about Cadenheads, we're gonna now talk about AD Rattray.
Yeah, sure.
So a separate company, also one which you represent, and also one famous for being an independent bottler, but also kind of a mirroring of Cadenheads, which has distillery ownership.
Exactly.
So we'll kind of go, we'll jump back to the beginning on that too, just a brief history of AD Rattray as well. I'm putting
Sure.
you through your paces today.
Thank you. And for all things considered, this history is even more windy and weird than the Cadenhead story. So bear with me on this one. But it starts in 1868. It starts with a man named Andrew Dewar Rattray. He sets up as a grocer in Glasgow. And as a grocer, he is, the grocers back then were making their own Scotch blends to kind of sell at their stores. And so that's how he kind of got into the whiskey business. But he also sold wines and rums and basic grocer goods. Mr. Rattray passes away in 1910. And the rights to the A.D. Rattray name and all assets are sold to the William Walker brokerage. He was a whiskey broker, also operating out of Glasgow. Um, and so that's kind of where everything went there. There was a young man by the name of Stanley P. Morrison who started working for the firm, I believe, in the 20s. That name is going to be a very important one because we're going to be talking about the Morrison family. So that's how this all happened. Stanley P. Morrison married William Walker's daughter, Elizabeth. And so that's how he kind of got into the actual family and thereabouts. Um, so throughout time, the Rattray name was inherited by, I believe, Elizabeth Walker's sister. So she owned the name after I think William passed and things like that. Stanley P. Morrison goes on to found his own whiskey brokerage, Stanley P. Morrison Whiskey Brokers. Then he grows that business, and he is essentially starting to buy distilleries in the 60s, most notably Bowmore Distillery on Islay. He purchases Glengarry near Aberdeen. He purchases Auchentoshan in the lowlands. And throughout that time, he renamed his company Morrison Bowmore, which is what people might more recognize. So that's the entity that we're kind of talking about. That's the beginnings of Morrison Bowmore. In the early 90s, Suntory takes a stake in Morrison Bowmore and ends up buying them outright and owning all of the assets to that. Fast forward, Stanley Walker Morrison, better known as Tim, who's the current chairperson for the Morrison family. He inherits the A.D. Rattray brand name from his aunt from way back when when she inherited it. So now he has it. And then he decides to get the Morrison family kind of back into the whiskey game. And so he releases the Stronach. Stronach was a 12-year when it was released back, I believe, 2002. And this was a old distillery that was owned by those entities back then. They were the agents for this distillery. The Stronach Distillery, now completely defunct and extinct. Founded in the 1890s, operated until 1928. So this was the first release of Stronach since then. The story behind that was that there were 4 bottles of the original Stronach in existence. Tim Morrison bought one, and he said, who is making something comparable. Like we don't have a distillery, but we want to kind of release this whiskey. We have this name. We want to resurrect this brand. And they tried all kinds of barrels. They tried all kinds of distilleries, and they came across Ben Rennes as a really good match. So that's what we have, and Stronach is on the market today. We can get it in North America. It's been rebranded as a 10-year, and I believe it changes depending on, the availability of the casks and things like that. 2004, AD Rattray starts their cask collection. That's what we kind of know them as in terms of an independent bottler. Since then, there have been annual releases from the cask collection, which is, single cask strength releases of AD Rattray under that name. And then the biggest news, probably in terms of, like you said, ownership of a distillery, happened in 2017, where the Morrison family actually founded the Clydeside Distillery, which is currently right on the River Clyde in the city of Glasgow. You can go visit it. I highly recommend it. But that's kind of become the new kind of spiritual home for AD Rattray. They do have another entity, like a home office in Ayrshire, but you can kind of visit and have the whole experience at the Clydeside Distillery. And that's, for the Cask of Scotland series, for the Clydeside releases that are currently coming, and then the AD Rattray as well.
The other kind of home office that you mentioned, that's the one in Kirkoswald, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I was curious about that because that one opened still relatively recently. That was in 2011 that one opened. And kind of, this is jumping around a little bit, but just to address that one while it's in my head. So they opened that location in 2011 in Ayrshire and moved the headquarters to that location at the same time. Kind of to the question I had earlier about not every distillery in Scotland you can visit or has a tasting room or has a visitor center.
Right.
Though even the ones that do are still fairly new. So was this one of the first kind of purpose-built visitor experiences in Scotland?
And again, this is another thing, I don't want to speak out of turn because, knowing your other independent bottlers, a lot of them are production facilities, and I think that, the time where, the AD Rattray, home kind of came about with the visitor center, people were really starting to see an influx of tourism within the whiskey industry, whiskey tourism, people wanting to, really get into it. And so they read the writing on the wall. I think that they wanted to do that. I don't know if they were the first, but I do know that they smelled it in the air and they really definitely wanted to get in on it.
Fair enough. And so we'll get to the Clydeside Distillery as well in just a little bit, but I want to jump back to this is a slight comparison, I guess, between Rattray and Cadenheads, but Rattray is also AD Rattray is also known for some of the blends that it puts out. And when I say blends, in this case, I'm also talking about let's say the Cask Isla series, Cask Orkney series, where it could be from one distillery, but it's either no name or blended together. And I told you, and I promised I was not going to ask like where this is from because I can't ask that.
You can, so, I just can't answer it.
You can't answer. Yeah, fair enough. So instead, the way I wanted to kind of dig into this a little bit is from a production and marketing side. So when the product comes out and the distillery is not named, let's use Cask Isla as an example.
Sure.
People undoubtedly, like, they want to know where it's from. They want to know, hey, I know you can't say it, but will you say it? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of thing. And I'm sure a lot of the time that's kind of the first question you get, probably, especially
always.
Yeah, always. Yeah. So I guess the first question I have on that is, does the independent bottler have an interest in wanting consumers to know which distillery or which distilleries these are from?
Two-part answer on this. One part would be sometimes they legally cannot. So under contract of wherever they're getting these from, some distilleries will just be like, look, if you want, we'll sell you the casks, but you're gonna have to do some dancing around in terms of like, where it came from, because you can't use our name, you can't use our entity, you can't use any of the character of that. The second part of that answer is I don't think they do, because they might only get a certain parcel of barrels from a particular distillery, and then they have this line that they've established, cask Isla, cask Orkney, cask Speyside, whatever it might be. When you run out of those casks and everyone knows where they're from and you can't get more, you have to discontinue that line, and therefore you don't have a line anymore. So if you are a little bit more vague about where they come from and you need to be able to change your source of production, you can do so and keep that line alive. And I'm sure it happens all the time, because contracts end, entities take over other entities, big corporations are massively involved in a lot of this stuff, and they might say, no, don't sell that, or we need this, or the economy changes, whatever it might be. It gives the houses more freedom to produce new lines and new products if they can be a little bit more mousy with their information, I think.
That's fair. And before I go to the next question on that, in case any listeners who aren't really into Scotch and they're more just into American whiskey, a good comparison that I was thinking of would be Cascade Hollow and Dickel. And you can't, I don't think there's any blending house or basically non-Cascade Hollow entity using their whiskey that can say that's where the whiskey is from. For a long time, though, we knew just if it was over a certain volume, there was only a couple
There
of
was only
Tennessee
another place
distilleries.
that could come from, exactly.
Yeah. Like it was Jack, George, or Pritchard's for a while, and like Jack wasn't selling it, and Pritchard's didn't have the volume, so
Exactly.
what was left? So you can kind of figure it out, and it's become more complicated recently because we have Tennessee Distillers Group, and Dickel also, notably when Nicole Austin took over as a master distiller, they really pulled back hard
Reined it in,
on
yeah.
sourcing. Yeah, so very little is going out there that is not their own product anymore, and so it's not as easy as saying, okay, it's Tennessee on a label and it's not named, must be Dickel.
Right.
Can't necessarily do it anymore. So it does apply just as much to American whiskey sometimes as to Scotch. And so putting you on the spot to be a consumer on this side.
Sure.
So if you're a consumer and wanted to know or wanted to try to figure out where something was from, at least, I mean, if it's a cask series like Cask Isla, it's Isla, so they're giving you the regionality.
Right.
There's only so many to choose from.
You have a one in basically 9 or 10 shot.
Exactly.
Here. Yeah.
Right. If it's over a certain, I think those are non-age data too. So you can't even say if it's over a certain age, we know it's not X, Y, Z. But if you're a consumer, how would you go about kind of thinking through the options of where a product like that is from?
I mean, what a fun game to play at home. I mean, like if you're really a whiskey fan and want to like kind of get your head into the game, I'm a massive fan of this. I would absolutely do it like Pepsi Challenge way. I would I would try different makes and age statements from different distilleries, and just to kind of see their overall qualities. And so you kind of know what the output of Bowmore tastes like versus the output of Lagavulin. You know what Bunnahabhain tastes like as opposed to Bruichladdich. And of course there are wildly varying marks coming out of all of these distilleries, but there's an overall spirit. There's an overall essence. Like you're gonna like some things more than others. You're gonna maybe not like some things. You're talking about Islay, you're talking about, peat levels, you're talking about, the quality of that peat, you're talking about the heaviness of the distillate or the spirit, the types of casks being aged. There's just so many factors that are going on. So I would love to play that game of just lining things up and trying different things until I think, okay, this lines up. This is what I think this is. Because of these qualities. Like it's more aromatic, or it's a little bit more, has more salinity, or it's more like more iodine qualities. There's there's a wide spectrum of flavor and aroma profiles that are coming out of all the distilleries on Islay throughout Scotland, but even particularly Islay, because people think like Islay, smoky, but it's very much more nuanced than that. I would just kind of, shoot your shot and see what you get. I think that's more fun than me being on here telling everyone this is from here, and everyone goes, ah. Of course, everyone wants to know, but like, what's the fun in that, right?
I agree. And of course, we want to know where it's from. I get that. I know you're part of the job is you got to take those questions and say, sorry, can't tell you that. But I think there is such a value of looking into that and trying to figure it out. Because then, like you said, you get to taste all these different things.
Yeah.
And I'm fortunate. I've gotten to taste a lot from Islay. I know there are distilleries I prefer and ones that I don't prefer, and certain ones that are, for example, ashier or more medicinal or more tarry, wood smoke. And you start to pull out these nuances from the distillery to a point where, yes, you went in looking to figure out where Cask Islay was from, but instead you may or may not, you may or may not end up finding out anyway. But in the meantime, you've explored all the entire island and the 9 or 10 distilleries that are there of what that island can offer. Like they have 2 or 3 distilleries on Islay that produce non-peated spirit.
Yeah.
One which does so almost exclusively.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, the workhorses like Kalila, they're doing 6.5 million LPAs a year, maybe even more. And honestly, it's one of my favorite distilleries to get from an IB.
Yeah.
Especially when you pair it with sherry. It's like pork ribs and barbecue sauce. It's delicious.
Peat and sweet. It's the way to go.
Sweet. It's the way to go. So with the just to confirm one other thing, you said when the company was Morrison Bowmore, but at a point, Beam Suntory, now I think they're just Suntory. I think they dropped the Beam a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. And they when they acquired, they were just Suntory Holdings back then. This was before the Beam acquisition. I think this was, I believe, like it was early 90s when this happened.
Right. And then the Beam one was 2014, I want to say.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So at this point, the Morrison family is completely divested of Bowmore.
That's correct.
Do they still have ownership in Auchentoshan?
So this is a tricky question because I hear different things, and I'm not a member of the Morrison family, even though sometimes I would love to be. The outright ownership is of Suntory for all 3 of those distilleries, Bowmore, Glengarry, and Auchentoshan. I've heard that like it is kind of like a minority thing with the Morrisons, or like they're there to advise on certain things, but I don't know how much of that is true, and I don't want to speak out of turn on that. I would think 60 years after the sale of Bowmore, that I don't think that they would have a lot of say as to what goes on there on the day-to-day. But you do, for some reason, it's one of those things that really stuck. The Morrison Bowmore name is like, you hear that, you know exactly what distillery we're talking about, and Bowmore just kind of sticks out. I'm not quite sure. You'd have to definitely ask somebody over at Suntory what the positioning is there, because the modern day Morrison family, as far as I know it, they're not making any kind of decisions for that distillery.
And
to my knowledge,
I'll be honest, I don't know if we're going to get anything out of Suntory. They've been
a little busy lately, probably.
Yeah, they've been a little busy lately for sure. I'm curious to see. This is complete tangent. But I'm just gonna throw that out to the ether.
Okay.
When it comes to Japanese whiskey, you can't really get a peep out of Suntory or Nikka, like the big guys over there. It's almost forbidden in a way to spill any secrets other than it was made at this, other than what they have to by law. Like it was made at this distillery, Harazaki versus Yamazaki, or hakushu,
Very,
So
very recent law, by the way. Yes,
yes, very
exactly.
recent law. Um, I'm curious if that method of management, I guess, or of information sharing or lack thereof, carries over to the American or Scottish uh, side, because I know ultimately it's all going to the same ownership at the top,
Yeah.
but because of the nature of the different cultures in which they are, like, just speaking very, this is a huge generalization, but like an Anglo-American, Anglo-English versus a Japanese culture,
Mhm.
where like we kind of expect in the US at this point to know certain things about our whiskey. Um, and I think there's that can be said for the UK and Scotland as well.
Yeah.
But we'll ask those questions, make it rebuffed. We'll ask those questions. So I'm curious if that differs a bit, but that's again, that's totally in the ether kind of question.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on that, two little anecdotes. One being that, remembering that Japanese whiskey culture was highballs and blends up until very, very, very recently. With Yamazaki winning, for the sherry cask back when it did, and that's when we really started hearing about and the prices rising and things like that. So, there was no reason to really ask about what was going on until extremely recently. Um, what was in your whiskey, where it was coming from, which is why I think the new legislation had to have been passed, because we need some type of transparency and some kind of ownership of a lot of that. The other anecdote that I heard, and again, this is hearsay, but with the Suntory acquisition of Beam, I heard that there was a lot of culture shock happening because, I think, bourbon culture, people are more free to talk about, methodology and history and what's going into everything. And here, take a tour. Here, let's tap into this barrel. Let's do whatever. It's very, it's nonchalant and much more buttoned up and traditional when you get into Japanese society, and everything is very proper and has its place and just known for order. So once you break that order, it's very much, and to have those two cultures coming together underneath one roof. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I've heard some anecdotes from some folks who will remain nameless that there was a bit of culture shock when that happened, and they had to find, mutual ground and a way to move forward as a company. I think they've done rather well for themselves, I would say.
Yeah, they're they're not struggling, shall we
Yeah,
say.
no, I'm not feeling bad for them.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's I would love to have been a fly in the wall to whoever got to, depending on the perspective, had to tell Fred no that he couldn't say certain things. Like, it's not
Yeah,
a guy
I don't want
known for
that job.
holding back.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So, but I mean, they ultimately people, fall in line, but that does too remind me, and it's again a culture thing of in Japanese whiskey makers of the old guard, not as much of the new guard, but of the old guard, you also just didn't go between companies. Like Nika, you wouldn't move from Suntory to Nika, for example. You'd do your whole career at Suntory. Whereas in Scotland, in America, we see a lot more movement of distillers, of brewers, of workers at every level. So there's a lot of just knowledge transfer in that way. So it's hard to keep things secret, if you will. And then the second half of that, and this is especially to the Beam family, is that because the Beam family is so in every distillery in the Kentuckiana region
Yeah.
has some connection to a Beam somehow, it seems.
Someone's got the
And
Beam last name at every
someone's got a
exactly.
Beam last name. And I was having a drink with Stephen Fonte, the brand ambassador for Yellowstone and Limestone Branch, and he said there are no secrets in bourbon because the Beam family gets together at Thanksgiving.
I like that.
You know, so while technically there's never officially been a release of what exactly the Beam bourbon mash bill is, we kind of know what it is.
Right, right.
Uh, Same thing with Wild Turkey and other ones where it's never made official, but we know. We
Yeah,
figure it out eventually.
it's a little bit looser and not, again, not as buttoned up. The other thing about the Eastern kind of philosophy of work ethos is that apprenticeship kind of mentality as well, where you're going to
Mm.
work somewhere and you're going to work there for your life, and this is what you do, and you have a sense of pride in that, and Not saying that you can't have a sense of pride in shifting jobs and going to different places. I think we found that as in Western culture. But this real, I'm going to find someone to learn from, and I'm going to, when they pass on, I'm going to carry this tradition on. It seems to be more of like an Eastern type of philosophy or way of thinking. Not saying it doesn't, pervade into the way that Westerners think as well, because we have several legacy folks
Sure.
in urban industry as well.
Absolutely. And we just had a fascinating conversation with MB Roland's Paul Tomaszewski, and about how important it is not only to look at the seventh and eighth generation distillers, but also the first generation distillers, and seeing what, not just the culmination of the legacy, but where the legacy begins. And for all these new distilleries that are popping online in the last 20 years worldwide, there's a lot of new legacy being created.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll circle back to AD Rattray, and it sounds like we're going all over. This has just been a fun conversation about these
I dig it,
things.
man.
So you mentioned Stronach was this distillery. It's no longer there. Was it originally Highland Speyside?
It was a Highland Distillery.
Highland. Okay.
Yep.
So that makes sense that Ben Rennes would fit pretty well with that. If I had to guess one, that would be that would be in the top five. Probably.
Yeah, there you
go. But again, like to your point earlier, because I've tried a lot of things, so
yeah, that's how you get where you're going. Yeah,
exactly. So it's a distillery that it no longer says you have the name, and what we think is 10-year now. That's kind of the regular release that comes out. But we do have this new distillery, as you said, from 2017, the Clydeside in Glasgow. Mm-hmm. So tell us about the Clydeside.
Clydeside, modern day facility. They built the distillery on the old pump station, the Queen's pump station on the docks on the River Clyde. State of the art. They really spared no expense. It's phenomenal. I went there September of last year. I visited, and right now they're producing a non-age statement called Stabcross that's available everywhere globally. They started producing in 2017, so we're about 5-6 year statement right now, but again, no age statement. Predominantly ex-bourbon, a little bit of sherry. They are aging in all different types of wood. It's one of the most beautiful still rooms I've ever seen, because you're right off the River Clyde, and the stills have the river right in back of it. It's and on a rare sunny day in Glasgow, it's a beautiful experience. That was the day I was there, the one sunny day in Glasgow. When I went there, they actually broke down the Stabcross, and you got a chance to try. And this wasn't just like you work for us, let's give you the VIP treatment. But I was there with the actual tourist group, and they're sampling the new make, which is wonderful by itself. Ex-bourbon, completely separated from the sherry, and then sherry separated from the bourbon. So you can taste the different elements of what makes up the Stabcross, and they're all great when they're in their own regard as well. They're making limited edition releases every year. They did one for the COP26 summit in 22, I think. This year's release, there's a few cases floating around of a cast strength version of Stabcross at, I believe, 60.6% ABV, which is wonderful. The regular Stabcross is at 46. Yeah, it's a great place to go and kind of check out. And they have a nice cafe there as well, because you gotta get the people in the door.
Absolutely. I guess in terms of regionality, where would Glasgow normally fall in the Scottish whiskey regions?
So it would be lowland. Both of the cities, like there's this kind of imaginary line that cuts between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and anything. If you talk, I have Scottish friends, and we have this debate all the time, because in terms of whiskey regions, this imaginary line between the two cities would separate lowlands versus highlands. If you're talking to a person who grew up in Scotland, Inverness is kind of the gateway to the highlands. Way up north. So there's varying opinions on where like Highland and Lowland kind of connect. But for our intensive purposes, Um, uh, it's that imaginary line between the two cities. So it would be considered a lowland, but it's not very common to have distilleries within city limits because of, you need your water source and you need, to store highly flammable liquids and things like that. Just recently, there's been a massive boon of growth of distilleries within city limits. You have Clydeside, you have Holyrood, you have Port of Leith, you have there's just so many popping up that don't need to be within these massive mountainous regions, and they're much easier to get to for like we were saying before for whiskey tourism, for people can just kind of, because if you've never been to Scotland, things are not so close together. You might need a car to be able to get to a lot of the distilleries that you want, if not a plane or a boat. So if you can visit 4 or 5 distilleries while in Glasgow and then take the train or drive or to Edinburgh and visit another 4 or 5, like that's a pretty full itinerary.
For sure. And I'm thinking too, the company's history between everything from Stronach to Bowmore, Auchentoshan, Glengarry, these are in many ways wildly different styles of whiskey being produced. Then
Yeah.
you add in the lowland style of an in the city style. And I guess I haven't had the opportunity to try this yet, and I will look for a bottle to do so. What is it going for a lowland style?
I think it's not trying to be anything that it's not. Um, I always mention with the caveat when and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is like, if talking about these styles, these are styles that are just known, because they're like rooted in our subconscious from the whole classic malt Diageo thing in the 80s, where they pounded into our heads. This is what Highland tastes like. This is what Lowland tastes like. Well, not everything tastes like, Cragganmore and Kalila and whatever else was kind of going on back then. So every single distillery is going to have its own distinct characteristics. That being said, I do find the qualities of Clydeside a little bit lighter. I do find them a little more agrarian. You can definitely get a lot more of the grain happening there, which I like in my whiskey. It is younger in age. I'm very anxious to see what's going to happen with older age statements as the stocks mature. But I think it's very well balanced the way that they're blending everything. I mean, they have a long history of being able to blend very well, and this is just proof of the pudding that they can do that and put out something that at 5, 6 years of age that punches way, way above its weight.
Yeah. And I I really do look forward to finding a bottle of that to try, because I'm very into trying these new distilleries in Scotland. Ones that,
Sure.
this one being one of them. Also, others of stuff talking about Dalmunach was a great. That was a great surprise.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, Especially for someone who loves Imperial, where that's literally on the site. you know, um, but there
Del
are
right?
no Dalmunach.
Sure it's not Del Ewan?
There is Dalyun, but that's not the one that's on the old Imperial site. Dalmunach was it's maybe, I guess it would be about 7 years old at this point. They came out with their first release last year. It was the Wolver at 6 years
Oh,
old.
oh, yes.
Yeah. And I tried it at where was I? It was in London. I think it was a whiskey exchange. Which, full disclosure, that was also where I found that bottle of Imperial, which blew my budget. But the
Most of those
um,
bottles do that.
they do, and especially Imperial bottle, like yeah. So yeah, but I happened to try it, and I was like, this does not taste 6 years old. It was at 60% ABV, and I was like, this is damn good. And there are a lot of Scottish distilleries that are on the younger side for Scotland
Yeah.
that are putting out some great stuff,
They're
and this is a great opportunity to check them out.
with some friends of mine, we invested in a cask just to try to help these distilleries out. I mean, of course, for our own interests as well. But we're like, let's invest in the infrastructure of a new distillery coming up, and we invested in a lowland city bound distillery, and I just recently you get samples at the first, third, and 10th anniversaries of it. So when it's still kind of new make, just so you kind of see the work in progress, on its whiskey anniversary, when it can legally be declared Scotch, and then at 10 years when it's essentially ready to bottle, and you need to kind of pay for more warehouse time if you want, if you feel that it needs it. And we all got around and we were drinking this 1-year-old, very dark new make spirit. And it was great. Like, I would have a glass of it. I mean, you can't legally call it Scotch, and I don't know if it would sell on the open market, but it's funky and weird and has a lot of personality. And I think it really speaks to the way that, a lot of these new distilleries are being made. There's some real quality coming out. I can't wait to see, again, as things age and products come out, there's going to be a lot of variety and a lot of really high quality goods.
I think that's the perfect tone on which to close this out, because we've talked about both William Cadenheads and AD Rattray, two very old companies in a great way, to long-standing tradition, legacies in these companies of independent bottling, of blending, and most importantly, I think, as we've talked about a lot during this interview, getting the names and or profiles of these distilleries out there so that people like us can nerd out and try them and figure out those lesser known distilleries that we really love, and search out every IB we can find of it.
It's all about testing ourselves. That's all this whole thing is about.
Exactly. So, I definitely urge people, if you're in London, if you're in Edinburgh, if you're in one of the places where Cadenheads has an outlet, go check them out and visit. It sounds like the one in Edinburgh was pretty similar to the one in London, and if so, you're going to have a great time exploring.
I believe
there.
Also like Austria, I think Switzerland, Denmark, Germany. Like, so it's you don't feel like you have to spend a weekend in the UK to do it. I mean, there's plenty of places to go check out Cadenheads.
Well, I mean, we are mostly a US based audience, but I do know there are a growing number listening in continental Europe and the UK.
Fantastic.
Also, if you're in Australia, which I don't think will help you too much, but you never know.
That might be a plane trip.
Yeah, they're more likely to do like the 4-week trip though, and do a bunch of different states and countries. So
and hit every single one of them. Why not?
Exactly. So definitely go visit. If you're in Glasgow, go, which I'll hope to be in maybe 2 years or so, and go visit Clydeside and see what is happening in the city of Glasgow, which is very different for a Scottish distillery. Most of them, like Gary said, most of them are out of the cities. They're in the countryside, and it takes 2 hours to get 5 miles between a distillery because you got to go a winding goat path to get there, but you will make it there eventually. But this one at least is in the city. So once again, Gary, thank you so much for coming on to talk about these two brands that I've admired for a long time. We've talked about offline, just like great legacies, great products that have come out from them, and really set the bar for independent bottling.
Thank you, David. This was a lot of fun today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So Gary, hang on with me for just a sec after we finish recording. It's been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. As always, listen to the outro to hear any kind of announcements or news, where you can find us. In the show notes, we'll also have links to both of these companies' social media and contact information if you're looking to find some of these bottles. If you're in the US and you're a stockist, or you're a store that wants to find them, or you're a consumer, we'll help you find those bottles because they want them to be sold and you want to drink them. So we'll figure out how to make that happen. So thank you again for everyone for listening. Please leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you can. It's been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast, and I will see you next week. Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps, or email me at david@whiskeyinmyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers Group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.